have nothing to crack today because I am outside in the beautiful nature.
No, I got this.
Oh, you got... Okay. Close enough.
Got him. Got him.
We just had a theme song, though. Do we really need
I can play the same
another
theme song.
Okay.
That's it, right? That's perfect.
Great.
The sweet dulcet tones of my fake dulcimer.
Oh my gosh. Welcome to the podcast, everyone. Yes. Okay. We really should have you. Intro. We really should have you record a new theme song with me at some point.
And it's gonna be just like that.
And it's gonna be the same theme song, just with you playing instead of just me. No, that's not true. Anyway. Welcome to the podcast, everyone. We are going to attempt this again. Last week, as you might have noticed, we didn't have a podcast because...
It was an unmitigated disaster.
Yes, GarageBand decided to freak out and corrupt my file. So my side of the conversation was gone, and it would have been just John talking to himself for half an hour with long pauses
but worse
in
than
between.
that. Yeah, because it's like... Yeah, so here's what I think. What do you think about that? And then it's 5 minutes of silence.
5 minutes of silence. Maybe
so
with
we're
like
back
the slight echo of my voice from your headphones, maybe being picked up by your microphone.
Oh man,
it could have just like turned
how awful would it be if we had tried to like amplify your voice that comes in the feedback through my headphones and like make
that
the
insane.
podcast. Well, we're back to you this week with 100% more redundancy.
100% more redundancy.
An extra audio recording.
And 100% more audio.
That's exactly right.
Nice.
And 100% more outdoors.
100% more outdoors. You can probably hear
Well, actually 50%. Only 50% more outdoors.
Some sounds being projected to you, birds, and there's some kind of construction going on, so I apologize for that, but it's the best I can do. We're out of our apartment. We just moved out a few days ago of our guest house we were in, and now we are staying with a friend for the last few weeks until we move to South Carolina, which is super exciting. But it means that I don't have as much space to work with. And people are taking naps inside, and so I'm sitting out here.
We do what we have to get you guys a podcast.
Yes, we do. We do whatever it takes.
We love you guys. We'll do whatever it takes to be with you.
Anyway, today we are going to be talking about a few things that we talked about last week, but you didn't get a chance to hear it. But also some new things.
I was kind of like stressing out about this episode because I have a weird thing where I feel awkward talking about something that I've already talked about because I feel like it's rehearsed the second time.
It feels like you're acting almost, like you're like,
yeah.
Oh, yes, and
you're pretending you're thinking these things for the first time. Oh, I didn't spend an hour thinking about this already.
I just thought of this off the top of my head. Oh, let me talk to you about it. Yeah.
Yeah, so we'll try to...
It's been long enough. I think we'll kind of, rediscover some of the things we talked about. But we also have some new things based on John's writing, because I, again, did not write much this week, but now that I'm kind of settled and we're completely moved out, I'll have a lot more time this week to do all kinds of writing.
Moving is just the worst
It's the worst. It is the worst.
It's the worst thing.
Very much so.
So yeah, we'll try to rush through the things, not rush through it, but like quickly move through the things we talked about last week, and we'll get to the scene that I wrote today actually. That has to do with drama and emotions, and when something's melodramatic and it's too much, and it's kind of a little too sappy or a little bit too heightened in terms of the emotional like weight of the moment. When you can lean into that, when to kind of pull back from it. That's the writing portion that we're going to talk about. But first, if you're ready to go, Vito, with this, we're going to talk about a question that was sent to us from a fellow by the name of Carl.
Sounds good.
Who is not a llama.
He is not a llama.
Not a llama.
By the way,
he may or may not have a hat.
Also, my audio may have changed a little bit because I just turned down my gain because I was seeing some waveforms like consistently on my little thing, meaning it was picking up the leaf blower or whatever somebody's doing back there way too loud. So I'm going to try to mitigate that by turning my gain down a little bit.
Well, everyone's happy to know that, Vito.
I might just cut that out.
That's fair.
Anyway, Carl's question.
So on to Carl's question. He spends the first little bit complimenting us, which, thanks, Carl. But he goes on to ask, essentially, I'll just quote him, actually. He is working on a draft that's a little more science fiction than fantasy, and the story takes place over the course of several centuries, so each chapter is told from the viewpoint of a different character. Do you have any theories on what makes a good question being told from a different viewpoint in each chapter, and what would be some issues or pitfalls to avoid? So the first thing that comes to my mind, and again, we talked about this last week, so I'm going to try not to sound rehearsed and like I'm
But they'll
trying to
never know. Oh, okay.
recall my thoughts. The biggest pitfall to fall into is basically you can end up with a collection of short stories that takes place in the same universe and over the same kind of timeline. If you don't have something to connect all of your different chapters with these different viewpoints, you have to have a through line that connects everything together. So, for example, the thing that I emailed him back with that I thought of was, if you have Lord of the Rings, the regular Lord of the Rings story is Frodo takes the ring to Mount Doom and destroys it. The alternative telling of the story in this kind of perspective, where you're traveling through this big timeline across centuries, and in this case across thousands of years with different characters, is you're telling the story maybe of the ring from beginning to end. And the first chapter is when Sauron creates the ring, and you spend some time with Sauron, and then Isildur cuts the ring off Sauron's hand, and then bam, now Isildur is the perspective character that you run with. And then the next chapter, it's Gollum, and then it's Bilbo, and then it's Frodo, and so on and so forth. You get these vignettes of the ring's life through the eyes of the person holding it. But the through line is the ring. You have this solid concrete connection that keeps it from being short stories in Middle-earth. It ends up being the story of the ring across time. That's the kind of thing you have to have in order to make that sort of storyline work, or else it just becomes... you don't get invested in the characters enough. You don't get invested in the world enough. There's not enough to grab onto in a short time to make a cohesive story. Is that along the lines of what you're thinking, Vito?
Yeah, pretty much. I think we mentioned last week too, again, not that you guys would remember, but there's a movie that does this very well, jumping back and forth in time, called The Red Violin, that basically does what John just said with Lord of the Rings, if you follow the story of the ring through the centuries. But it's a violin that was made in Cremona in, the 1700s or something, and it follows the history of this violin through the decades and the centuries, with the different owners who had it and played it, and their stories over the years until the modern day, which is used as kind of this framing device going back and forth with the modern day, and then back to a different character, and then back in modern day, and then back to a different character, because there's this auction going on, and this guy, Samuel L. Jackson's character, is trying to buy the violin, and he's discovering its history as, he researches it and stuff. Really, really good. I think it might be based on a book, but I'm not sure too. But basically, I think the most important thing with those sorts of stories is getting very, very specific with your characters very quickly, making the audience connect with them in a very short period of time, giving us enough time with each one of them to really get a feel for them before moving on to the next one. And also, I think it's really important to know how your characters are influencing each other through time, whether it's through the specific object they all have at some point, whether it's like a ring or a violin or whatever it is, or all working towards the same goal perhaps, or I don't know, they're in the same family or something. There has to be some through line that connects them all and influences that they somehow, some means through which they influence one another, and whatever that is for your story. I think those are the two biggest things I would say about a story with that sort of back and forth feel. The TV show This Is Us also does this really well by jumping back and forth in time, but it goes back and forth all the time between the characters. It's not just like one section of the show or one episode is one character, and then they never go back to that character. They're always going back and forth through time, and it has this really cool feel of like certain characters who aren't with them anymore. You almost feel like they're still there. There's this cool like sort of beyond time feeling the show gives you, where your loved ones are still with you, through time, and or whatever. There's a lot of cool things you can do with that that device for sure. Yeah.
Do you think it's important to have a viewpoint that you return to? Because
I think so.
I think it can add a lot of weight to the story, and also it gives you some characters to really identify with throughout the story, even if you're not spending a ton of time with them. Think Assassin's Creed, right? You're doing this thing where you're jumping into all these different assassins' heads over time across the many different games, of course. But the constant in most of them is Desmond. And you're
even
getting
though he's
to
the most boring character.
even though, what is it? Yahtzee,
Zero
it's like a
punctuation.
video game zero punctuation reviewer guy. He is like compared him to a fish or something. He's like as interesting as a fish. But even so, what that game tried to do, even though it didn't necessarily succeed, so it's not a great example, but you're going into these interesting snapshots of previous worlds, essentially, even though it's all in the same world. But you're getting these historical glimpses and then returning to a main storyline with the same set of characters. I don't think you have to do that, but I do think it goes a long way to ground your story. It helps you to ground it, I guess.
Yeah, it's certainly not necessary, but I agree. I think it's typically stories that do this end up having some sort of framing device like that, whether it's one character at one time they keep going back to, whether that's like a storyteller who's telling the story, or characters who are doing research to like find out the history of whatever, or anything like that. I think I mentioned too in the episode no one heard. I've had ideas for sci-fi stories, or a series of stories that take place on a world ship. This like ship that functions as a sustainable habitat for people who are traveling long distance, long term towards another star system or something like that. It's like this self-sustainable habitat on this 1,000-year journey towards another star, and you can do all kinds of cool stuff with that. I think whether you're talking about different phases in sort of the civilization on this ship, different characters along that line. I was thinking more one book for each one. But it might be possible to do one book where you have more of a progression like that, as long as it feels complete and you don't feel like every sort of vignette in that timeline felt like it was pointless. Again, what's the through line? What are you getting towards? If you do it as a book series, I feel like you can make those self-contained stories that might relate to each other a bit, or call back to one another a little bit. But you don't have as much of a need to have that through line, although I think it's still important. But
Sure.
Anything like that.
Yeah, and the final thing I think we'll say on that is, in the email, Carl kind of insinuated that he wanted one chapter per perspective, and I think that might be a little bit much. I think
Or not enough.
you have to limit yourself to the number of perspectives to maybe like... It's hard to put a number on it. It depends on the length of the book. But I would think you need to give at least a handful of chapters to each one to give the reader enough time to get involved, especially because you're dealing, over the course of centuries, you're dealing with changing cultures. And whenever you drop a reader into a new culture or society, there's a learning curve associated with that. And the steeper your learning curve, the harder it is to get into the book, generally speaking. And if you're dropping the reader into the new cultures multiple times, that learning curve just keeps smashing into them, and that's the kind of thing that can get people to stop reading a book quickly.
Especially if you're really feeling the need to like show how cool this new era is and all the things that have happened and all the history.
Yeah,
and, really.
And
make
I think
that a
that's
big
one
part
of the and that's one of the appeals of doing this kind of thing, is you can show that kind of stuff, and there's a lot there to show. But if you go overboard on that and try to do it like every single chapter, it's going to really grate on readers, and it's going to be hard to stick with it. I think with this kind of thing, maybe you stick to, I would say even like 3 to 5. Maybe you can do more if you want to, but stick to a few different timelines and jump between them, maybe even if you want to get that variety going. If you want to have that feel of a different thing each chapter, jump between a few things and go back and forth instead of doing it linearly.
Yeah,
But
I think that's one of the more interesting things to do with these sorts of things, rather than just have this linear progression of like, 10 years later, boom, 100 years later, boom, 1,000 years later, boom, something like that. I think it's cool to show the through line by going back and forth between the character stories, almost like in any multiple POV character book where you're jumping between characters. It's just that they're not in the same time as each other, I guess.
Yeah. And then you could get the opportunity to kind of tell parallel storylines.
Yeah.
Maybe you have 3 different coming-of-age stories that take place in the same world 1,000 years apart, and you explain the differences, or show the differences, I guess, in those coming-of-age stories because of the different times. There's a lot of stuff to do there, but I think you have to approach it really creatively and limit yourself on how many of those perspectives you're going to throw at your readers.
Yeah, unless you get really, really good at just embedding exposition within the story in a very kind of organic way, which is
and
very,
that's
very hard
really
to do.
hard. It's hard to do at a high level.
Yeah, maybe don't start with that.
Yeah.
But
So, Carl, I hope that helps you out. hope that answers your question. And best of luck to you. I hope we get to see it on the shelves someday.
Definitely.
So, moving on, I think we'll jump into the emotion and drama stuff I was talking about before, if you're good with that.
Sure.
So I was writing a scene today, and this is something I've come across before as well in my writing, and it's the idea of when to lean heavily into emotions and get pretty intense with things, and when to lean out of them. In addition to that, aside from just emotions, just the drama in general and the intensity of situations outside of like battle and stuff. That's a whole different story. So I have a scene where I have this really kind of wretched character called Soul. He's a torturer and he hates himself for many reasons. And he's going to visit his father, which is a very emotional thing for him because, he wants to go see his father, but he has to go back to the deep, dark prison where he tortures people. And it's kind of hard to switch back and forth between those things and maintain your sanity. So he doesn't do it very often, but he kind of has to this time. And so there's a lot of emotions at play. There's a lot of space to dive into what he's feeling and the depths of his despair and all this stuff, right? You can lean as far into that in this situation as you want to. And deciding how much of that to give into was kind of something I was struggling with as I was writing. It ended up kind of being one of those things where I just had to pick something and go with it because I didn't want to spend an hour debating, how far to take it. So I'm not necessarily in love with the final product of it yet. But I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on that kind of thing. How much is there a kind of a guideline you go by when deciding how dramatic to make something, how much to lean into those emotions? Like, it can get tiring if you do too much of it.
I think the best rule of thumb is to go ahead and go with whatever is kind of flowing for you at the time, especially in your first draft. Don't think about it too much, which seems like is exactly what you did.
Pretty much, yeah.
So just go with it. But in general, too, I think in revision, it's definitely important not to pour it on too thick, too fast. There should be, just like with the plot, I think the characters, stories have, sort of an ebb and flow and an up and down kind of undulation throughout the story, and it's important to be aware of where your character is in that and where you want them to go. Don't give the audience too much, emotional impact too fast, and don't give it to them for reasons that aren't earned, I guess, if that makes sense. Like, if they don't really know this character too well yet, and they don't know his relationship with his dad, they don't know really why he hates himself so much, they don't really know the conflict that he has, maybe establish that in sort of not at your highest emotional kind of point yet. Kind of build up to that. Don't give them too much too fast. It's hard to know exactly how much to let your characters feel and kind of how much of their emotional conflict to introduce to the audience, especially in the beginning. But yeah, like I said, I think it's the most important thing right now to just kind of write, especially as you're still discovering this character and
Sure.
you're kind of figuring that out. You can always take that out and replace it with a little bit, more of a lower level of emotion later. But it's important to get that out now because you're probably going to, through that process, you're probably going to discover for yourself exactly how this guy's mind works and who he is and what he cares about and why he cares about it and that sort of thing. So I think that's the most important thing for now. Later, we can probably figure out more of, is this too much, too fast, or that kind of thing. But definitely important to think about. But I think it's more important to kind of go with your gut at this point.
Yeah. And that's what I did. And it was one of those scenes where when you're writing it, you're kind of feeling like, I'm probably going to come back and
this is a bit
change
much.
this later. There are lines and even paragraphs and scenes that I write where I'm like, I really like this. This is what I want it to be. And I'm happy with it. And there are other times when you write stuff, you're like, this is good, I guess, but I'm really not in love with the way this is reading right now. I'm just kind of getting through it. And it was one of those those scenes.
Or it could be like I've had this many times where I'm really feeling the emotion of a scene and I'm really kind of I'm immersed and I'm just like, feeling for the character and I'm enjoying writing this like, really conflicted scene that they have and they're, just struggling emotionally and I'm, oh, this is so great. Oh, this is awesome. It's just flowing out. But I also know at the same time that this is probably not going to,
might be a little gratuitous.
I haven't earned this with the reader yet, probably at this point in the story. But I'm just going with it. It's important. I think it's good to know that, and even maybe make a note for later. But I think that as writers, we really enjoy. That's part of what makes writing so fun is immersing ourselves to that extent. And
right.
The temptation, I think, is sometimes to give too much of that emotional conflict at every single point in the story, and just because it's fun to write, and we can do it that way. And also from a story perspective, the events that create that emotion might not go in the place where you're writing it yet, but maybe that's just what's flowing out right now, and that's what you got to get out. So it's important to make notes in the margins. I think, like on Scrivener, there's a little section for that, and go back later and figure that out. But that's for later.
And it's also the kind of thing that where it can be helpful to have a couple people who are reading your work as you go, who can kind of tell you, hey, this is kind of a little heavy-handed for this part of the story. Like, you might consider changing that later. And obviously that can happen later. But I like to kind of get some of that feedback as I go, so I know as I'm continuing, where I should be going and where people kind of would identify with it, or if I should do that kind of emotion again, or if it should be kind of held a little more in check in the future. It's the kind of thing where if you have people who you can trust to give you good feedback on that kind of thing, it can be a good place for it.
For sure, yeah.
Excuse me.
Any more thoughts on that?
Not really. I had a decent week of writing with it, when you're considering I've spent a good bit of it still kind of thinking about my story and planning ahead a little bit. I have something of an idea of where it's all going now, which is nice, and just got to work towards it. There's still a lot of elements that are up in the air, but I know enough to move forward for now, so that's good enough for me.
Nice.
And I'm kind of trying to push myself back into it a little bit and get a little more writing done than I have in the past couple of weeks. So I'm excited about that.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to having a little more time now that we're going to be able to relax a little bit. Yeah. Cool.
I did some.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Okay. I did some math based on my word count right now, and I calculated out. And if I sold a paperback, I would have like 60 pages of paperback book written. I'm like, oh, that's so much. Dang. It's awesome.
That's pretty cool. How'd you calculate that?
Yeah, it's awesome. Huh?
Apparently,
it's like for a paperback, it's like 250 words a page.
Oh, really?
Yeah, something like that. It varies, obviously, but that's kind of a decent benchmark. If it's a little bigger, closer to 300 or 350, but it's motivating to me to see, like, a few months ago, I had a blank document, and now I have, if I had a book, it's 60 pages of a book that's just sitting in front of me, and it's written. It may not be the best, but it's there. And that motivates me to want to press on and get to 100 pages and then to 200, and keep pushing on that way.
Yeah, I definitely like knowing how many pages of a book that I would have written at this point.
Yeah.
Because I don't really know what word count means yet. I don't really know what that correlates to in terms of pages just yet. But
yeah. No, nor do I. Well, now I do. I didn't. Now I do. I think that's good for the writing portion of this thing. To close things out, we wanted to play a quick game that we already played, but you weren't here for that. It was just us talking to each other for no reason. So we started a game that we like to call Good Trope, Bad Trope. Basically, we bring up a trope, and what we were doing before is bringing up the ones that were present in my story in particular, and tropes or cliches that we could potentially fall into in that book, and discussing whether they're a good trope or cliche to have, or if they're bad, why they might be bad, why they might be good, and then giving them the very basic and nondescript rating of good or bad,
which is very black and white, but
meaningless and not helpful at all.
It's our game. We get to choose.
By gosh, by golly.
And we're doing this because it's very useful to know what sort of tropes or cliches are making their way into your story, and it's not bad to use them necessarily in and of themselves, but you need to be aware of them and use them intentionally rather than just sort of falling into the pattern that you've experienced before in the stories that you like. And that can work out too, but it's much better to be aware, I think, when you're using something like the damsel in distress or the hero's journey or whatever it is.
Sure. And so much of writing is finding all the different tools to put in your tool belt so you know what to use and when to use it. And tropes can be tools. Knowing that there's something about the number 3 that a group of 3 people is compelling. A book of 3 acts is compelling. These are things that could be considered tropes or cliches, but that are very helpful when it comes to building stories and knowing how to tell them. So these are things that can also be helpful in that regard. So, with no further ado and no more talking whatsoever, we're going to jump right in. So, the first one that I wanted to talk about was one that kind of plays centrally in my story and could overwhelm it in the bad way if I let it, and that is sort of the MacGuffin trope. If you've never heard of a MacGuffin, Vito, what is a MacGuffin?
A MacGuffin's like a thing or even maybe a person or something that your characters are searching for and trying to acquire throughout the story. Is that correct?
Yeah, sure. Okay, sorry. And in my story, there's this stone. It's this magic stone that the bad guys are looking for, and the main character doesn't really know what it is yet, but he has it, and he knows he's supposed to do something with it. It's pretty nondescript at this point, but it's an object that kind of controls the plot and has the plot run along. And if I make the story about that, it's going to be kind of boring. I could do that quite easily. I could fall into that, and I don't want to. I need to make the story about the characters and about the results and the implications of the stone, maybe, but not about the getting of the stone itself. One of the examples I came up with was Indiana Jones, right? An Indiana Jones story is Indiana Jones finds out about some artifact, and then the story is him trying to get it. And it makes for a good story because ultimately what you're actually watching is Indiana Jones punching Nazis and, running about caves and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. You end up kind of almost forgetting about the object he's looking for because it doesn't really matter. It's just the thing that gets him to do what he's doing. So So if you use a MacGuffin, that's the way you need to tell the story. It needs to drive the plot, but not be the be-all, end-all goal in and of itself.
And it can't be about them trying to get the thing. It has to be about their relationships with the other characters and in the process of the journey, maybe how they realize that thing isn't actually what they needed in the first place. How do they transform? Still, how do they develop as a character? What is their arc? That's still more important than how do I get them to get the thing? What's the next step on their journey to get the thing? That sort of stuff.
Sure. So, I think it's a good trope. I think that if you use it creatively and understand what you're doing, you can definitely create a very compelling plot with that.
Yeah, I don't think there's very many tropes that are bad in and of themselves. I think it's mostly going to be, a sort of, it depends how you use it sort of thing. Because they're tropes for a reason. They're tropes because they work and they, fulfill sort of certain expectations that a certain type of audience has, whether that's for, fantasy or, different genres or different cultures, anything like that. So I think a lot of this is going to boil down to, it depends on how you use it.
Sure. What about the chosen one, though? That's one that I'm kind of just tired of.
That's pretty played out for sure.
And again, it's not bad. It's just I don't want to see it right now.
Yeah, and it's really hard to do it without becoming cliche, because there's a difference between a trope and a cliche. The trope is just sort of a certain story element that many stories use.
Yeah.
A cliche is something that's maybe a trope that's worn out its welcome, perhaps.
That's a good definition.
Become a little passé or something like that.
Would you go as far as to say that a chosen one plot is kind of lazy?
It can be. I think it can be if it's just sort of your first idea and that's just what you go with, and you're kind of copying the structure you've seen in a million fantasy stories, and there's not a whole lot of other original thoughts that go into it. I think it certainly can be creatively lazy to go with the chosen one story, but I think there's also a way you can make it, spruce it up and make it yours.
Yeah, I think
There's certainly authors that do that, but it
Yeah.
is also the crutch that a lot of authors lean on when they don't have a lot of original ideas of their own, or maybe they are just sort of regurgitating things they've seen before.
Yeah, I think it depends on the idea you have. If you actually have a good idea that utilizes a chosen one sort of plot line, but it's not about that, it's just, part of the story, then maybe it's not creatively lazy. But if the question arises, oh, why is he doing this? And the answer is, oh, because he's the chosen one, then that's kind of lazy, because there's no rationale to that. It's just like, oh, because he is. I mean, it's because some supernatural force decided eons ago that he was going to do this. Okay,
And there's different
I
types
guess
of
there's
chosen
that.
one stories too. Like there's the chosen one who is chosen by some divine force beyond anyone's sort of power. And of course, the question is, how do they know that they are? There's also the chosen one who's been chosen by somebody who might be fallible, some sort of king or prophet or something like that. That is a person that you can talk to and interact with, and they might have made a mistake, and that could be a question that comes up. There's also chosen one that's sort of chosen one by object, I guess. Like they find this thing that makes them the chosen one because they're the only one that can use it.
The sword and the stone.
Sword in the stone, that kind of thing, of course. Although he's also destined to use that thing because of his
Whatever.
whatever. Anyway, so there's different ways to go about sort of a chosen one, quote unquote, story. It is a little bit. I think there's better ways to go about crafting a character. It's
Yeah.
a bit of a shortcut to say this person's the
Right.
very special in this way that only they're special and they've been chosen for this task.
Why?
And-
Because.
because it's external to their character, or at least it usually seems to be. It doesn't depend on who they are as a person. It depends on, somebody else's prophecy, or it depends on them finding a certain thing. It's not their character. It's just kind of something intrinsic about them that they have no control over, which isn't as interesting as someone who, gets up the gumption to, actually go and do something themselves and be active. It can create a very passive character that
Sure.
it becomes boring if the character is too passive. Oftentimes in chosen one stories, the villain is the active one who's like working against the chosen one because their other one's been chosen. What are they going to do? They got to do something about it, and they're trying to
right.
counteract this prophecy. Go against destiny and that sort of thing. And the best chosen one stories have an active protagonist who, despite those sorts of things, manages to be active. So I think that's a big part of that.
Yeah, it can also lead to some predictability, because if you're the chosen one, then you're probably going to be the one in the end to defeat the bad guy. Like, it's going to be you because you're the chosen one. That's how it works.
But, that does create a very satisfying arc a lot of the time if done well.
That's true, but a satisfying arc that's predictable, which isn't
That's
the
true.
worst thing, but
Yeah,
there
so
are
if you
better
want sort of
things.
an original and predictable story, don't go with that.
Yeah, right. So that's probably as close to bad trope as we're going to get, because
Yeah.
most things are objectively neutral, or subjectively neutral, objectively neutral. I don't know. I always get confused. And the last one I want to talk about is one that I do have in my story, which is sort of the redeemed evil character / anti-hero. And that's not the main character, but Soul, the torturer character in my story, is, essentially he's a bad guy. He hurts people for, that's what he does. And there's some redemption that happens later on in the story, and he kind of joins the good team. But that's kind of something of a stereotype that happens in a lot of these kinds of stories, and I've struggled a little bit with thinking how I'm going to end up making that feel creative and unique. So, what do you think about that idea?
Yeah, it's hard to do. The worse you make the character, or I guess the worse the things the character does, the harder it is to redeem him, both in the eyes of the characters around him and in the eyes of the audience. It's not enough to just give them a reason to be the way they are. I don't know. I feel like it has to be a good enough reason, but not so good that it's like, well, why are you bad in the first place then? That sort of thing.
Yeah.
it's really tough to do that, and it has to be a process too. It can't just be like at the very beginning of the story they're already sort of this redeemable character, even though they do bad things. I think at the beginning of the story they have to be more bad, at least in the audience's eyes. And then as the story goes on, you can kind of put them on this journey that, if not totally redeems them, makes them at least relatable and empathetic. It makes the audience empathetic towards them in a certain way. There's a lot of great characters that do this very well. Although everyone says talks about Tyrion Lannister, it's not the same thing though. In Game of Thrones with Tyrion Lannister, he never
becomes like a good person.
Well, he's actually a pretty good dude from the beginning. He's kind of a jerk to everyone and pretty rough around the edges sort of guy, but his bad qualities are not hurting people and that sort of thing. It's more just he's a little rough around the edges. You're talking more about making this character who is pretty clearly a pretty bad guy and does some pretty bad things, like torturing people, and then making him an empathetic character for the audience. So I don't think it's quite the same thing. It's not so much anti-hero as it is kind of a redeemed bad guy almost. Yeah, it's an interesting conundrum to have for sure.
Yeah, and it plays into the character I've given him thus far in the story, because I want him to be conflicted about what he does internally. I need to give some perspective to the way other people perceive him, because other people don't see his conflict. He doesn't let it show. He appears on the outside to be this awful torturer guy, but internally he's very conflicted. Yeah, like he doesn't even feel like that kind of thing. But that's not been seen yet by the reader because I don't have anyone describing him from the outside. So I need to find a way to get that across so that there's some contrast when he turns around.
What might be interesting is if you describe the interrogation of the crew, Darren's crew, from their perspective, perhaps. And show this very stoic sort of torturer that's interrogating them from their perspective, which of course is this terrifying guy, and then go back later and in a different chapter and sort of show things from his perspective, not the same events necessarily, but show that it's the same character somehow. Maybe him walking out of the room, and now you're in his head, and that's an interesting sort of switch up. Maybe
that's actually fascinating, and there's a hole right now where I could do that already. So Sol walks into his first torturing session and the camera cuts off, and then you cut back to him when it's over and he's leaving. So there's already a hole in I wouldn't have to replace anything to make that happen. That's actually a really interesting idea. I do like that.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. So there's ways to do too about this for sure. But yeah, it just depends on not making him so kind of evil as far as the other characters are concerned, that it's unbelievable for them to turn around and kind of think of him a different way. And thinking of that both from the other character's perspective and from the audience's perspective, earning that sort of duality, I guess, is really important. But, I think people are pretty readily willing to accept complex, sort of gray characters these days, especially.
I think people are looking for that even.
Yeah, and people like that, and I think they'll go along with it if you give them good enough reasons to empathize with a guy like that, and hopefully develop him and sort of fulfill the audience's desire to see him kind of come around by the end of the story. The more that he's on that path, the more they're going to root for him to keep going on that path and get better and that kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah, I like that a lot. I think that gave me some ideas.
Cool. Awesome.
For sure.
Well, I think that about wraps up what we were hoping to accomplish today. It looks like the file is recording.
Oh, good.
Well, so hopefully we'll have something for you guys this week.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and plug our socials.
Alrighty. So first of all, you can find our website, www.worldbuildersanonymous.com. You can find more information about the podcast, all of our prior episodes, some articles we've written, and even more than that. Again, that's www.worldbuildersanonymous.com. You can find us on all the social medias at World Builders Anonymous, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Those are basically all of them. If you want to find us and ask us a question on Reddit or see what we've been up to on there, our username is WBA_podcast. And if you'd like to email the show with your critiques, criticisms, or questions, or anything you like, really, you can email us at wbapodcast@gmail.com. And if you're feeling in a generous mood, please leave us a review on iTunes, because that really helps. And I think that's it.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you guys for listening. We'll see you next week.
Have a good one.
This show is sponsored in part by Audible. Visit worldbuildersanonymous.com/audible to check out what the guys are listening to right now and to receive a free audiobook.